Welcome to the Think Factory podcast. We got one question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Welcome to the Think Factory's Women Roundtable Workplace Edition, where we learn how women think big and grow their business, powered by OGC Solutions. My name is Alka Bahal. I'm a partner with Outside General Counsel Solutions and the chair of our Corporate Immigration Services Group, and I'll be your host today. I am very pleased to have with me today Jennifer Eccles, Senior Director and Head of Clinical Genetics at Genomic Prediction Clinical Laboratory. Jennifer has navigated an unconventional path to reach her current prominent position, which I'm very excited to talk more about. Welcome to the podcast, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
You work in the very fascinating and highly specialized field of PGT testing. Can you explain to our listeners what this is?
Yes. So PGT stands for pre-implantation genetic testing, and it's genetic testing that occurs at a very specific time during the IVF process when individuals and couples are creating embryos and need to do specific testing to learn about the health of their embryo.
Fascinating. So it's got to be very fast-paced, very precise.
Absolutely, very specific. The testing occurs at a very specific time during the IVF process when embryos are created. So we're constantly in contact with IVF centers around the world, communicating about different patients that are going to be sending their samples to us. So it's very fast, and there's no room for error when it comes to any type of genetic testing or laboratory work in general. So
Right.
it's exactly that.
And that's all that the Genomic Prediction Clinical Labs does, right? Focus
Yes.
solely on PGT testing.
We focus solely on genetic testing that pertains to embryo health. So different types of pre-implantation genetic testing and tests that relate solely to trying to get pregnant in the IVF space. That's all we specialize in.
Understood. Now tell us about your role that you play in the company and in sort of the process with patients.
Yes. So I'm a trained genetic counselor, and genetic counselors in general, I think of myself sort of like a translator. I translate genetic information into plain English. That's how I always think of my role in any work that I do. And so at Genomic Prediction, my role is to really take all of the data that's curated from all these thousands and thousands of embryos that we get to process every year, and basically turn that information into readable reports for clinicians, for doctors, nurses, patients, to be able to understand the genetic health of their embryo. And part of what we do is exactly that. My team works to help create the reports that patients are actually seeing and clinicians are actually seeing. And that's one huge aspect of my role. And then the other aspect of my role is truly to help patients and clinicians navigate their genetic testing. So we talk to patients all the time. Part of my role at the company is to specifically counsel patients about the type of genetic testing that they may need or want. Genetic testing sometimes is a need and sometimes is a want. It can be both. And so my role is to really talk to them about what the benefits of certain tests are, what the limitations are, what information they will tell you and not tell you, and help patients make informed decisions that benefit themselves. Part of what I love is working with families who are specifically coming to our laboratory to talk about specific genetic conditions that they may have or that are in their family, or where a patient and their partner may be a carrier of the same genetic condition, and help navigate from that point of knowing, okay, we have this concern. How do we get from this concern to actually designing a test that we can use to address this concern? And that's a process that can take weeks and months to move through. So I get to really know couples. I get to really know their clinicians and what they're worried about, and that part of the work I really love very much. Those are the main areas. It's essentially, helping people understand genetic information so that they can use it in a way that makes sense to them.
I understand. And that must be complicated to explain. So you kind of have to be the bridge between the clinical side, where you're not in the lab, but you still have to understand how the tests work, what the results mean, in order to explain that to the patient and have that person then understand how to interpret those results and how that might impact the decisions they make on going forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And not all PGT is created equal. So we really do have to understand, how our test works from a purely technical level. What is it able to detect? What are the limitations of our testing platform? How does that differ from other testing platforms that a patient may have read about on a blog, or with their friend who also is going through IVF at the same time, or whatever? Their results may be different. That can be confusing for individuals going through the IVF process when they're talking to their friends or their clinicians. So yes, we have to know literally everything about the genetic testing that we offer. And then, this is something I've studied for 25 years and we have to take that and, explain it in a way that makes sense to somebody who's never studied this,
Right.
in the same way that I would want somebody to explain something to me that I haven't studied for, the same amount of time. And that's where the skill really comes in, and the, ability to really be able to say, okay, this is what this means. This is what we worry about. This is what we don't worry about. This is what we could miss. This is how we test during pregnancy. There's a whole, process of, like what are we looking for? What are we finding? What are we missing? How do we address what we could potentially be missing, and going through all of that process? So yeah, it can definitely be difficult, but that's the part I love. That's the part that I feel like I've gotten really good at over the years. I didn't necessarily start out good at that, but I think that's something that, being a seasoned genetic counselor, lots of genetic counselors, that's sort of our superpower now. We get really good at, tweaking away at what's really important and making that really like simplifying it so it really can be understood by everybody that on the team that needs to understand it, including the patient, including the couple.
Very interesting. Very parallel to what I do as a lawyer, taking these sort of complex legal concepts and applying them and explaining to the layperson, how that is really going to affect you, or what we have to do to get from point A to point B. Exactly. How interesting that you have the same problem that I do, which is, well, I read online, or I heard about this.
Yes. That's a huge, it's a blessing and a curse. I mean, social media is a blessing and a curse. I think it's really important for people who are going through the IVF process to find their tribe.
Right.
And groups that, social media groups and blogs and online support for people going through IVF. It's one of the biggest, from a medical health perspective, it's one of the biggest, most active groups are people going through IVF. And I think that is actually wonderful. I think that's great. I think that people need a lot of support when they're going through the IVF process. People are definitely not alone. Individuals who are going through IVF are in great company. There's lots and lots of people who are doing exactly the same thing for exactly, having the same exact, worries, thoughts, concerns, anxieties. I think that's fantastic to be able to connect with people on that level. But the flip side of the coin is that sometimes that means that there can be misinformation about specific tests. There can be misinformation about what one lab may do versus another laboratory, and that misinformation about, one test being better than another test, where that may or may not be true. It could be, but maybe it couldn't be. So that can lead to a little bit of confusion and difficulties in counseling patients, because sometimes we could get off track a little bit about what is exactly going on with that particular patient. What maybe they have read, seen, heard is not necessarily pertinent to their own situation, but has to be addressed as well, because it's something that they're engaging in online and seeing online, and we have to address it, so, and that can absolutely be difficult. So it's both sides of that social media coin are, they present their own good and bad, for sure.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about you and how you ended up here. Certainly this isn't where you had planned to be, and you couldn't have, because this type of role didn't exactly exist really when you first sort of started entering the workforce, right?
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't have been able to dream of working in a PGT laboratory when I graduated, and certainly not when I was thinking about becoming a genetic counselor. So I came up when I was an undergrad at Rutgers University. I was coming up in the mid 90s. And during that period, like everybody else going to college, deciding, essentially what they want to be when they grow up, or what the next step is. And that being very daunting, I always knew that I wanted to work with people. And I always knew that I loved, healthcare and medicine and all of that. And I also had really become to be very interested in genetics in general. This was the time of the Human Genome Project. This was the time when they were cloning sheep for the first time. Dolly the sheep was a big deal back then.
I remember that.
Yes. And so you couldn't even not, pass the, a newspaper, and it was all newspaper at the time too. You couldn't not pick up a newspaper and, something about genetics was in the news, consistently. And I was very fascinated by that. So I was, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't have the personality to work just in a lab doing, laboratory bench work. Because it is so precise. It requires a certain type of personality. It's very specific. And I had enough classes at that point, where I was dabbling in lab work, that I knew that wasn't going to be my path. But I also knew that medicine wasn't necessarily going to be my path, because I was like petrified. To this day, still am petrified of health emergencies and, blood and bodily fluid, like all of that. I knew that wasn't going to be my thing. But I really was looking for some intersection of all of those things. And I don't actually remember how I became aware of genetic counseling as an actual field, but at some point during college, I did, luckily. And that was eye-opening, because I realized that there was a path where I can actually study something I love, genetics and particularly clinical genetics relating to healthcare. And I can have a job where I talk to people and talk to families, talk to individuals, talk to patients, and I can marry those two things together. And that was a total revelation. So I ended up going to graduate school, at the time, one of the biggest programs for master's in genetic counseling, human genetics, was Sarah Lawrence, and that's where I went for my graduate degree. And during that period, I really did realize that I loved working with pregnant people, and at the time, genetic counseling, you could there was a couple places you can put yourself as a genetic counselor back then. It's very different now, but you could be a genetic counselor and specialize in cancer genetics. You can be a genetic counselor and specialize in in pediatric genetics, or you could be a genetic counselor and specialize in prenatal genetics. Those were sort of the main choices back then, with a couple, few exceptions. And I realized that I loved, working with people who are trying to become pregnant or were pregnant. And so I worked for many, many years in very busy prenatal centers, working with patients who were pregnant and doing genetic testing during pregnancy, like amniocentesis or carrier screening, taking detailed family histories. And I really enjoyed that very, very much. But as I grew in my career, I also, it got busier and busier. I was working, I worked at a bunch of different places in New York City. The last prenatal position I had was at Columbia University, which is one of the busiest prenatal centers, not just in the U.S., but I would say around the world.
Yeah.
People travel all over the world to see the clinicians there. And it was a wonderful experience, and I learned so much. But it was also around the time that I was starting to get married, started thinking about having my own family at that point. And I knew I couldn't do all of those things necessarily together at that time. And also there was a little bit of stress for me on a personal level, knowing what I knew about all of the different ways that pregnancy can not work, right? And all of the different genetic conditions that can occur, or types of issues that can occur, and losses that can occur, and miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies, and finding out results, in the middle of the pregnancy. Those were all the people that I was that's what everybody was facing. Right. So I kind of needed a break. So I took one. I was in a very fortunate position that I could take one. And I had my son first, and then I had a daughter. And around the time that I had my daughter, I was, itching to go back. But I knew I needed to go back in a different way. And I couldn't do that same sort of grinding schedule now that I had small kids, a baby at home. So I started exploring being a genetic counselor in the laboratory space, and contracting and writing and working on, working from home, which was very novel. It was before COVID. We're very used to it now, but it was a little bit different. It was, a number of years before COVID. And I started writing, test descriptions. I was, doing, different contracting work. And I started really realizing that I kind of really loved that too. And through that work, like with any other career, you meet people. And I was lucky enough to meet people who worked in the PGT space. And then I started going back full time, and really becoming a genetic counselor that started specializing in IVF and pre-implantation genetic testing, and that led me to genomic prediction. So I would never have imagined when I was, in the 90s, graduating Rutgers, that, eventually I would have a role, in this type of space. It was so new then. It was barely a blip in compared to what the possibilities are now in terms of pre-implantation genetic testing. So that's my long and windy way of how I got here.
Super interesting career path. I love that you really knew what you wanted. You wanted to marry something with healthcare and sort of that scientific aspect, not totally being immersed in the science alone, but having that human connection. And you found a path to make that happen. I think that's just amazing.
So I really do consider myself so lucky that it worked out, that way, and that this career existed. And yeah, I feel very fortunate that I was able to find genetic counseling and find, this career path. And it's not a career path a lot of people know about. Like even to this day, there's still not a lot of us in comparison to other, careers and field, in the healthcare field. We're still a small bunch, We're getting bigger, but we're still a
Mhm.
small bunch when you compare, how many physicians there are, how many nurses there are, how many social workers there are, how many, when you look at the other fields, we're still small and mighty,
Mhm.
So I do feel very fortunate that somehow, genetic counseling and I found each other.
It's wonderful. And there's this ever increasing demand with IVF, right? It's become so much more
Yes.
common.
Yes, yes. Yeah, many more people are pursuing IVF. So there is a huge need for genetic counselors in the IVF space, because genetic testing in IVF, and it's not just, pre-implantation genetic testing. There's lots of genetic tests that anybody going through IVF, should be offered, as part of, uh, their, routine screening, even if we're not specifically testing embryos,
Right.
but testing partners to find out if they're both carriers of the same genetic condition, there's a whole bunch of things. So, chromosome analysis. So yes, there's a huge need. And with everything else, the type of genetic testing that exists now, is light years away from what existed when I first became a genetic counselor. There's whole exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing. There's a whole world of genetic testing that's available to babies, who are in the NICU, and doctors need to find out really quickly, what might be the underlying issue for a baby that has a cluster of symptoms, or, like if something's going on in a pregnancy. Cancer genetics has exploded. There's all different types of testing now that doesn't just inform risk, but informs treatment outcomes and treatment options and immunotherapy. None of that existed,
No.
30 years ago, 20 years ago. So, yeah, so there's a huge need for genetic counselors in all of those spaces, but in the IVF space, absolutely. There's definitely not enough of us to go around quite
And
yet.
the pipeline is small, right?
Yes.
There's not a lot of programs out there, and the programs are small. Tell me about that.
Ex Exactly right. Exactly right. So when I graduated, there were, a handful of genetic counseling programs, maybe 10 or 15, if that. And each class that graduated had 5 or 10 people, which is like sort of mind blowing, because we're only graduating globally, maybe 100 or so genetic counselors a year,
Yeah.
so, and my program, when I graduated, we were the biggest one, and there was, I think, 22 people that graduated. So still tiny. We felt really big in comparison,
You're
but
huge
still
comparatively.
really tiny. Yeah, it's crazy. Now it hasn't actually changed that much. What has changed is the number of programs, and that's growing. So instead of 15, there might be 40 or 50 programs. There's a lot more genetic counseling programs,
Mhm.
across, the United States, and in other countries as well. But I think the US has the most. But even those programs still only graduate a handful at a time. And part of the rate limiting step, the reason it's not like, let's just graduate as many people as, we can, part of it is, the genetic counseling program is, separated into parts. Parts of it are, actual lectures, actual classroom time, but then the other part is real life experience, going into different centers, having what we call clinical rotations, and really learning how to be a genetic counselor by actually following genetic counselors, and learning from actively working genetic counselors, and starting to see patients. We have to have a number of cases that we've seen before graduation, before we can get, certified. So that's the rate limiting step. You have to have the space and the ability to educate everybody in the right way.
Yeah.
And so it's very competitive in that way, because there are only a certain number of spots for, a certain number of people, because that's sort of the stopgap right now, is that. So until that changes, we're still only graduating, a couple, 100 genetic counselors,
Right.
a year. It's still small in comparison to other fields. So we're growing, but it's, it's a slow and steady growth, and I don't think we're growing in some ways we're not growing as fast as the need,
Yeah,
obviously.
I can imagine the speed at which the science is evolving
Yes.
and being adapted sort of by the general public. I can imagine it's going to outpace,
Yes.
where you are. So a lot more work for you, Jennifer.
Yes. 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 Good problems and hard problems. Yes.
Exactly. So your field is not really what we would call diverse, right? It tends to attract sort of the same type of person, shall we say?
Yes. 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 That's absolutely true. It's a really interesting field because the genetic counseling, the very first genetic counseling program was the program at Sarah Lawrence. And Sarah Lawrence, is a Seven Sisters school. It was a school for women, and the program started in the 1970s. And part of the reason, we're called genetic counselors has to do with sort of the genesis of that program and the fact that genetics was a burgeoning field at the time, and certainly there were many things known about genetics, but not to the depth and breadth at all of clearly what we know now. But also from a clinical perspective, there was very little that could be done if you knew you had a risk of a certain condition in your family, and so a lot of it really was counseling, talking about how people felt about having a history of a certain condition in their family and the risks and concerns that they had going through that didn't always necessarily get to be paired up with an actual genetic test at the time. So, so the counseling part was, and it's still important, don't get me wrong, but nowadays we can do counseling, along with a specific test that we can offer you. Back then it was a lot of counseling, and a lot of this is what we expect the recurrence risk to be based on the pattern, the Mendelian pattern of disease, not necessarily because there was a test that was done that identified the gene and the variant in that family. A lot of that didn't exist. So so it's interesting that it all began, in a school that celebrated, education in for women, and attracted a lot of women, and attracted women that had the ability to go to a very expensive school to get this education. And so a lot of people that started out way, way, way back in the day were people looking for a second career that were wealthy and had the means to be able to go to school, and get this career. And genetic counseling since then has certainly become more diverse, but we're still very much, female centered, and, female forward career path. The majority of genetic counselors are women. I think I don't know the exact number, so I can't be quoted, but I think at a minimum, like 80% of genetic counselors are women. We do have more men becoming genetic counselors, which is wonderful, and I think is really, really important because, that matters. And this career path should be made available to everybody, but also, it's important to be able to speak to people that you feel like understand you and vice versa. And it's important for it to be diverse from an ethnic perspective, diverse from a cultural perspective, diverse from a, gender perspective. There are lots of, for example, even in the IVF space, there are many men having, in same-sex relationships, having children and being able to speak to people who, understand the very particular needs that they have, is really, really important. So it is becoming more diverse. But we have sort of the opposite problem that many fields have, where we're trying to get more women into the field. This is different. We have the opposite issue, which is really interesting. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's really true. The patient population, from the 70s to today has certainly changed significantly. All sorts of combinations of cultures and,
Absolutely. Amazing. And
access
to genetic testing should be really, we want
to
try
worldwide, right? You're not just sort of like a local lab that's just performing services for a couple of IVF physicians. You're like this major international organization. You're getting, information and coordinating with other or entities all around the world.
Yes, that's correct. We have IVF centers that send samples to us from exactly that. We're not just located in the US. We have patients from all around the world. So we have patients from Canada, we have patients from Mexico, we have centers in Africa that send samples to us for their patients. We have I just met a patient yesterday from the Philippines, from a center from the Philippines. So yes, we work with people from around the globe, and which I love. I think it 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 reminds me all the time that that when people are going through the IVF process, the concerns are the same. Around the globe, we're all worried about the same thing. Everybody wants to, the need and the desire for people who want to. Not everybody has the need and desire to have a child, but for the people who do have that desire, that the strength of that desire is very strong. And people who are going through the IVF process, it sort of builds and builds, and it's a very unique, feeling and the sort of desire to make things go as quickly as possible is universal because the wanting to get to that goal of having that positive pregnancy test and having an ongoing pregnancy, that it's such a strong need. That's universal. The desire to want to understand their genetic information and hopefully have a healthy baby, that's like innate. It's part of us, and it's part of us around the world. So how we get there may be a little bit different, but that need and those desires and those concerns and the questions we get, are universal around the world. So I love meeting everybody from different parts of the world, and it never ceases to amaze me that we can do that so easily in this day and age, and click a button and all of a sudden I'm able to talk to somebody halfway across the world, and it's morning by me and it's nighttime by them. And here we are together trying to work through a problem together. I love that. I love that.
That must be fascinating. That's incredible. And there are timing issues in terms of samples and protecting them, and we can still handle that even internationally. That's amazing.
Yes. It that fascinates me too. But yes, absolutely. Samples. Look, so we're very fortunate. We're not receiving embryos. So that's a huge concern that couples have, is if their actual embryos are being shipped, from place to place.
Right.
And that would make me nervous too, because then we have to rely on, the male to be taking care of, all of these, like these precious, precious samples, irreplaceable samples. But instead we're receiving biopsy samples from embryos, which are still precious, that they're still precious samples, but these cells are able to be placed in, certain medium, certain chemicals that keep them stable and safe. And so they're able to arrive to our laboratory. And DNA in and of itself, DNA is very hardy. So when we extract DNA, and if we get a good DNA sample, like that's glorious. Then we have what we need, and that's a hardy, stable sample. And then we get to do, all the different things that we need to do. So yes, where it is pretty amazing that somebody can have an egg retrieval and create embryos in across the world.
Yeah.
And those samples can get to us and be tested in a laboratory in New Jersey. And those results get sent out. It really is quite fascinating that can happen regularly, as part of our normal thing. Yes, it's so cool.
Speaking of science fiction, how do you anticipate AI impacting what you do?
I think that's a really good question. I definitely think that, we all know it's here. I was going to say it's coming down the pike, but it's really, that's not really right. It's here. And we're here. I think that there are definitely ways that we can and should use AI to help us. there, in a laboratory especially, I mean, we're all about automation. We're all about, you know, doing things in a certain way, in the same way each and every time. We're all about trying to make sure patients are notified and get as much advance notification as possible about how their samples are doing and where their samples are in the process. And all of, automation doesn't always require AI, but AI will certainly help with that. And that's something we talk about constantly, right now about, what tools are currently available and maybe coming down the pike that can, assist that. There's a lot of chatter in the genetic counseling community about how AI specifically can impact genetic counseling. And a lot of that, chatter and talk is about how we can use like, big, language bases like, chat GPT and things like that to actually provide, specific patient facing information to patients. And that's a space that I'm also interested in seeing if that will eventually help us, because sometimes a patient, it may take a little while for them, even if somebody makes an appointment and they're scheduled to see me next week, that's a really long week if they're waiting for information about their embryos. So to be able to maybe provide some preliminary information first and then still speak to a person. I think it's important that we don't replace people, right. And especially in a space that really requires, deep understanding of, what people are going through and what their real needs are. I don't think AI is there yet, but I do think that we can definitely use these types of programs to be able to provide some, specific information to just be able to give something before they get to meet with us. And so we're not there yet, but it's definitely coming. It's definitely coming. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it's moving fast, right?
Oh, for sure.
Per day, it's something new. So what are some of the opportunities or challenges that you are looking for in the next year to 3 years?
Yeah, so I mean, our hope globally at Genomic Prediction is to make our tests available essentially to anybody who would want to be able to utilize or need to utilize our tests. And so that requires, because it's not just, a patient or a couple who gets to make that decision or has full control of that decision. We're like a little bit of a trio. We have the PGT lab, that's us, and then we have the IVF center, and the patient's doctor and clinical team and embryology lab. And then we have the patient themselves or, that couple themselves. And it's a little trio that needs to work beautifully together. And so we want to make sure that, we want to grow to make sure that we are visible to as many patients as possible. But with that, so that's the, sort of the general, like very, very loose goal. But, from a more personal perspective and, what I do and part of, running the, genetic counseling, and clinical genetics part of our laboratory is making sure we can keep up with that growth. And making sure that we scale in a way that makes sure that we're able to handle increased patient care with the same high level of care that we offer now and want to continue to offer. And that's what patients deserve. So that's what I'm always worried about. Is, if we get more samples, how are we going to make sure that all of these patients are counseled appropriately, that they have their, questions and needs met in a timely manner, that reports need to go out within a certain time frame. Like all of these things are, critical parts of, a working, functioning PGT lab, and that's where I come in from the clinical perspective and the patient, facing perspective is how we're going to do that. So that's always on my mind. That never quite goes away. That's our worry. That's my worry in a good way. These are good problems.
It's a good problem, right? Because you can always scale the laboratory, right? That's just sort of logistics and personnel and equipment. But the human part of it, which is your domain, is more complicated. There are a lot of other moving parts that come with that scale.
Yes. Yeah, and if we can't accommodate that, that's when we can get that's when problems can arise. And that's not the way that we don't want to function in that way. Right now, we're really proud of the fact that we offer a really high level of care. We've really, I'm definitely certainly proud about the types of tests that we offer and the quality of genetic testing at Genomic Prediction and all of that. But I'm on a personal level really, really proud of the face-to-face patient care that patients get. And it's really important that patients feel comfortable. They have to feel, comfortable with the, not just their understanding their results, of course, but just comfortable, like feeling like they're that their samples are being cared for, they're being cared for. And that's the most important piece of what, we do and that I do there.
And you should definitely be proud of it. So you're doing an excellent job in that area, and that really sets you apart, in my opinion, from other places. That counseling piece is invaluable, having been on the other side of it.
Yes.
Not understanding the testing per se, but all that testing feeds into decision making.
Yes.
And so to have somebody be that bridge and help you understand, and all the eventualities, those tests in and out. You've seen, everything from every angle. So for having patients to be able to kind of pick your brain and have that resources at their fingertips, it's got to be so comforting.
Yes. I hope so. And we really want, what would worry me is if a patient didn't reach out or didn't know they could reach out or didn't realize that they can, speak to us directly, things like that. Like those are the things we're constantly working on to make sure that we make ourselves as available as possible, because that's exactly what you said is exactly what I want. I want patients to make themselves available to us so that they don't have to sit and worry and ruminate over questions. That's exactly why we're here. To help facilitate that.
You are a wealth of knowledge. So you preempted my last question, I think, but I'll ask you anyway.
Yeah.
You can repeat yourself. This is a question I did not prepare you for, but it is our traditional final question on the Think Factory podcast, which is, what keeps you up at night?
Not doing a good job keeps me up at night. That is actually, that is what keeps me up at night. I want to make I have a great day when I, have a day filled with interacting with patients and, hearing a patient say, "This helped me." That thrills me to even now, even doing this for 25 years. That's still each time that I get very excited about that. Those are the things that that bring me joy and happiness. Having a day where we get all these reports out and I know information is being disseminated, that gives me joy. So what keeps me up at night is when we fail at that, or if there's a failure, to do that, or if a patient is not satisfied, not with their results. Sometimes, results are always going to be, good, bad, and different, otherwise. But if they didn't get what they needed in order to make decisions that make sense for them, then we need to do, we need more interaction. We need to do more, or if, things like that. So those are the things that keep me up at night. If I really do care about, doing a good job. I really do. And and I really do derive joy from, having interactions with, people all day long about these really difficult decisions that they're making, about their family planning, about, this impacts them so significantly. So that
Like
really
altering decisions.
yes, yes, yes. So that brings, me a lot of uh satisfaction to be able to, I don't even know if that's exactly the right word, but there's definitely something about that feeds me and keeps, and you know, I really do look forward to doing that on a daily basis and working with people on a daily basis.
Yeah, I share that with you. I think that that's what makes you so good at what you do is you recognize the importance of the information and advice you're giving. And
Yes.
I imagine you stay calm and cool and collected. People receiving bad news from the genetic testing are probably in a tailspin.
Yes.
And, so your counsel and your guidance, I'm sure, has helped innumerable families, develop and grow in a healthy fashion.
I appreciate that. I really hope so. That's like in a nutshell everything. Like that's really what I hope for.
That's what drives you. I love that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us today, Jennifer. I've really enjoyed our conversation. You want to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you or the lab?
Yes, yes. So if you're interested in learning more about what we do at Genomic Prediction, you can go to lifeview.com. And you can learn about all of our different tests and all of that. If you want to reach out to me, if you're someone who's considering the genetic counseling field or interested in sending me an email, I'm at jennifer@genomicprediction.com.
Terrific. Thank you again, Jennifer, for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
That's this edition of the Think Factory's Women's Roundtable Workplace Podcast. I'm Alka Bahal signing off. I'll see you next time.